Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark, and we are in 1 Timothy chapter 6. We're looking at verse 1 this lesson. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16. Thy words were found, and I did eat them. And thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, as I began a little bit last lesson, chapter 6, verses 1 and the first part of verse 2 deal with Paul's instruction to servants. And remember, it seems to imply that verse 1, Paul is talking to servants who have unbelieving masters. And in verse 2, Paul is talking to servants who have believing masters. Now, in verse 1 here, he says, let as many servants as are under the yoke count their own masters worthy of all honor, that the name of God and his doctrine be not blasphemed. Now, the Greek word for servants is doulos, and doulos means a slave. Paul many times referred to himself as God's doulos, God's bond slave. So, at this time in history, we need to understand that in the Roman Empire, there were approximately 60 million slaves. And therefore, having that many slaves in the Roman Empire was a big threat to the government and also to their masters. So, the Roman government and also the masters of these slaves had very strict and harsh rules because they did not want these slaves unifying and coming together because it would cause great problems. So they treated the slaves very harshly, and they had harsh rules of working conditions and also of living conditions. So they implemented these rules in order to keep these slaves from unifying. So we need to kind of have the mentality right concerning why Paul is writing this. So he says, and remember, Paul here is not dealing with the question of whether there should be slaves or not. But Paul is dealing with the issue of the slave's mentality towards their masters. So he says here, let as many servants as are under the yoke. And this phrase under the yoke implies hard work and maybe also difficult living conditions. And it also seems to imply that their masters were not saved. So then he says here, so the servants or the slaves who are under the yoke, under difficult conditions, count their own masters. Now, this Greek word for count is hegeomai, and it means to lead the way or to lead something before the mind. So it means to have something in front of your mind and to lead the mind in that direction. So, these slaves were not just to give an outward appearance of service only, but they were to settle in their mind to honor their masters. So Paul tells these slaves, these servants, settle it in your mind that you're going to honor your masters. Because why? God sees the heart. As Christians, God sees our hearts and he knows our thoughts. So God knows if we're just putting on an outward show for our boss or for whoever we work for or whoever we submit to. God knows if it's just an outward show. He knows what's going on in the heart, how we really feel and what we really think towards the people that are over us. And so Paul here encourages these slaves to honor them, to settle in your mind that you will honor them. So he says, to count, and it says here then, their own masters. Count their own masters. And I thought about that, And, it's easy to look at someone else's master or someone else's boss and to think how wonderful it would be to work for them, right? I'm sure we've all done it sometime, Boy, we always look at someone else's working situation or someone else's boss, and we think, boy, I'd like to work for that person, right? And the grass is always greener, right? and yet we don't work. And you know what? But we look at other people's bosses and we want to work for them, but at the same time we kind of despise our own boss. And yet there are other people who are looking at your boss wishing they could work for him or them or she or whoever it is. And so it goes back and forth. And we all have had bosses that we either liked or we didn't like. And we can look back in our history and we can think of bosses that we've had and that we've really liked and other bosses we didn't like so much. And there's always that situation there where we like these slaves, we are to count our own masters. Don't be looking at other people's masters and counting their bosses as worthy of honor, and we despise but count your own master, your own boss as worthy of honor. And he says here, honor, the Greek word for honor is time. And it means to value something by fixing a price on it. The slaves were not to honor them for who they were as a person or what they believed or by the possessions that they had. The slaves were to honor them simply because their bosses or their masters were put in a position of authority. Even Jesus submitted to the Roman authorities. So you may not like what your boss or believes in or likes in general, but because they're your boss, we are to submit to them. We are to submit to our boss. And it doesn't matter whether we believe what they believe or not, but it matters that they are the boss in a position and you are under them, and therefore you honor them as your boss, but you don't have to agree with everything about their life. As I said, even Jesus submitted to the Roman authorities. Jesus didn't say, when he went before the Roman government on his trial, he didn't say, who are you? I'm Jesus, I'm God's son, you have no authority over me. See who I am. And all of a sudden, then, like Superman, he opens up, and the glory of God, the glory of God shines out, and consumes like 20 people in the room, and then the Roman authority is sitting there and then see who I am, No, even Jesus submitted to the Roman government and abided by their rules, and he was put in the court of law under the Roman authority. So we also, though we may not agree with our bosses, yet we do submit to them because they are in a position of authority over us. Some workers start taking up things that their bosses like to maybe gain some kind of an advantage at work. Maybe your boss likes motorcycles, right? Maybe your boss likes gardening or fishing or bowling or whatever. And therefore, because you want to get in on the inside track, at work, you start getting interested in bowling or fishing or whatever, hunting or whatever the boss is interested in. You start putting this facade on that you like it. Maybe you do. Maybe you actually do get interested in it. But all this is basically lies and deception. If you really are, then it's not a lie and it's not a deception. But sometimes people get interested in things that their bosses are, not because simply because they want to an advantage at work. But it all comes from lies and deception. And I think what we really need, just be who you are at work. Who really are you? Be who you are. Don't be somebody else at work because your boss is something. Be who you are, and let your boss honor you as a worker for who you are, and you honor your boss for who he is. And if by happen chance you like the same things, then that's good. But to make up, to create this liking of things between you, it's just fake. And then he says, to finish this verse, that the name of God and his doctrine be not blasphemed. So we are to honor servants, slaves. They were to settle in their mind that they were to honor and appreciate their boss for the position that they were in. Honor them and serve them as their master. And we serve our bosses because they are put in a position over us. And why do we do it? We do it because that the name of God and his doctrine be not blasphemed. As a Christian, everything we do is a reflection of the nature of God and of his word. It's the same with parents when they allow their kids to go out on a Friday night or on a Saturday. They want to go out, right? And they get old enough, and we think to ourselves, well, how will they represent the family or the family name? Right? The teenagers, whatever, 15, 16, 13 years old, 17, when they go out and with their friends, how will they represent the family? And it's the same with Christians. How do we represent our Father in heaven? How do we represent our family, our other brothers and sisters in the world around us? In Colossians chapter 3, turn to Colossians chapter 3, verse 17. Paul writes to the Colossians and he says, and whatever you do, in word or in deed, do it all to the glory of God. Do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, giving thanks to God and the Father by him. So whatever we do, whatever we speak, and this includes work and includes whatever, choir, shopping, whatever you do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God and the Father by him. And then verses 23 and 24, verse 23 and 24 says, and whatever you do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men. So whatever you do, includes work, do it as to the Lord and not to men. Why? Because verse 24, knowing that of the Lord you shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. Now, the context of verses 23 and 24 go back to verse 22. The context of the verse is verse 22. Servants, talking about slaves. Obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. So the context of verses 23 and 24 is talking about slaves. So here in Colossians, Paul's telling the slaves to what? Whatever you do, do it heartily. Do it as unto the Lord and not unto men. Because of the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. People are watching, and they will either see God in our service or they will blaspheme God. And that's what he's saying here. Servants, obey your masters, honor them. You don't have to agree with everything, but you do honor them and work for them. And you may be under difficult situations, difficult living conditions, but honor them and serve them. Why? Because if you do it as unto the Lord, you'll receive a tremendous reward, and it will honor God. People will see that, and it will be a testimony unto God. But if you don't, they'll blaspheme God. They'll reject God and his word. All right, we'll get into verse 2 next lesson. But until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.